The Dominion had ruled the galaxy for centuries, crushing every rebellion, conquering every world, and bending entire civilizations to its will. No species had ever stopped their advance, and none had survived resisting them. The mere sight of their warfleets was enough to make planets surrender without a fight. But on that day, something appeared in the depths of space, something that defied explanation. It was a warship, massive and silent, emerging from the void like a ghost. No known design matched its structure, and no records mentioned a species that had ever built such a thing. It carried no insignia, no identification codes, and yet it broadcast a single message across every Dominion frequency: humanity has returned. The message sent shockwaves through the Dominion's high command. Humanity? That was impossible. They were a dead race, a failed species that had vanished ages ago. No records of their extinction remained, only scattered myths and forgotten warnings. Yet, this ship, this impossible construct, had declared itself as their return. High Admiral Kelkoth, a veteran of 1,000 campaigns, scoffed at the idea. "A desperate trick," he said, waving away the concerns of his subordinates. "A single ship means nothing against the Dominion. Send a fleet. Erase it." Within hours, a task force of 50 Dominion warships moved to intercept. They encircled the lone vessel, weapons locked, their captains confident in their overwhelming numbers. Yet, something was wrong. The ship gave off no energy signatures, no gravitational distortions, nothing that a functioning warship should have. It was as if it wasn't even there. Scans returned gibberish. The hull reflected no readings, as though it absorbed every signal sent its way. The Dominion commander hesitated, unsure of what they were facing. But orders were orders. He gave the command to fire. A storm of plasma beams, missile salvos, and kinetic rounds streaked through space, converging on the target. Explosions erupted across the void, bright enough to be seen from planetary observatories. The Dominion forces waited for the debris, for the wreckage to confirm their kill. But when the fire faded, the ship was still there, untouched, as if reality itself had rejected their attack. The Dominion officers exchanged nervous glances. That was impossible. No shielding technology could withstand such an assault, and yet the ship hadn't even moved. Then, for the first time, the human warship responded. It did not fire conventional weapons. There were no visible projectiles, no energy beams, no missiles. Instead, a pulse spread outward, silent, invisible, and unstoppable. The Dominion fleet had no time to react. Ships vanished where they floated, entire battleships blinking out of existence in an instant. There was no wreckage, no screams over the comms, only an eerie silence as half the fleet was simply erased. The survivors panicked. Some tried to flee, engines roaring at full power, but it was useless. The ship moved not through conventional thrust or warp drives, but as if space itself bent around it. It was suddenly there, close enough that its dark, alien hull filled every viewscreen. The Dominion commander shouted orders, demanding a retreat, but the ship was faster. A second pulse swept through the fleet, and more vessels were erased. The few remaining ships, crippled by fear, turned and fled, their captains abandoning all thoughts of fighting back. High Admiral Kelkoth watched the disaster unfold from the Dominion homeworld. His face, once hardened by years of war, now showed something unseen in the Dominion's long history: fear. The ship was wrong. It didn't behave like anything they understood, and worse, nothing they did could stop it. The High Command immediately called for reinforcements, demanding that every fleet in the sector converge to destroy the unknown enemy. But deep down, they already knew the truth. This was no ordinary battle. This was something else. Something beyond their understanding. And as the warship continued its silent, unstoppable advance, the message echoed once more across the stars: humanity has returned. Panic spread like wildfire across the Dominion. The destruction of their fleet had been impossible, yet it happened. A single unknown warship had erased dozens of their strongest vessels without firing a single conventional weapon. No wreckage, no survivors, just an eerie silence where mighty warships had once stood. High Admiral Kelkoth refused to believe that the Dominion, rulers of the known galaxy, could be brought to its knees by one ship. He gathered every war fleet in the sector, assembling an armada of 500 warships. Each one was equipped with the most advanced weapons the Dominion had ever created: world-ending torpedoes, gravity disruptors, energy lances capable of tearing moons apart. They had crushed rebellions, destroyed entire civilizations, and yet, for the first time in Dominion history, the admirals leading this fleet were afraid. The warfleet moved into position, surrounding the human warship from all sides. This time, there would be no mistakes. The plan was simple: obliterate it with overwhelming firepower before it could react. Every weapon was primed and ready, targeting computers locked onto the enemy. The countdown began. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 1. The order was given. The void ignited. Thousands of energy beams and torpedoes streaked across space, colliding with the warship in an explosion so massive that nearby moons trembled from the shockwave. The Dominion fleet didn't stop. They fired again and again, refusing to let the enemy recover. Entire squadrons unloaded their payloads, turning the battlefield into a storm of destruction. The darkness of space burned with the fury of 1,000 suns. No ship, no matter how advanced, could have survived such an assault. And yet, it did. The fires cleared, and the warship was still there, untouched, floating silently as if it had never been attacked. The Dominion officers stared in horror. Their sensors showed no shield impacts, no damage, as if their weapons had never even reached the target. It was impossible. No technology in existence could ignore the combined firepower of 500 warships. The Dominion fleet faltered, hesitation creeping in, but before they could react, the warship moved. There was no visible propulsion, no sign of a warp jump, yet in an instant, it was among them. One moment, it was a distant target; the next, it was inside their formation. Ships scrambled to maneuver away, but space itself seemed to bend around the warship, making escape impossible. And then the retaliation began. It did not fire conventional weapons. There were no missiles, no beams of energy. Instead, a pulse spread outward, silent, unseen, and unstoppable. The first Dominion battleship in its path vanished. Not destroyed, not torn apart, simply erased from existence. The pulse expanded, swallowing more ships. One after another, they disappeared without a trace. The Dominion fleet, once an unstoppable force, was being wiped from reality itself. Admirals screamed orders, but there was no counterattack. Weapons refused to fire. Targeting systems no longer registered the enemy as a physical object. Some ships tried to flee, but their engines failed, as if the void itself had turned against them. The warship glided forward, completely indifferent to their terror. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The grand dreadnought Fury of Dominion, the largest warship ever built, fired its superweapon, a black hole cannon designed to erase entire continents. The beam lanced forward, distorting time and space itself. The human warship let it hit. And then, as the Dominion forces watched in horror, the dreadnought's bridge fell into chaos. The weapon had just fired a shot powerful enough to collapse a planet, and it had done nothing. Before the crew could react, the warship responded. A thin, almost delicate-looking beam of blue light flickered from the warship. It touched the dreadnought's hull for less than a second. Then, in the blink of an eye, the largest vessel in Dominion history folded in on itself, compressed into nothingness as if it had never existed. The Dominion commanders, once proud and arrogant, were now paralyzed with terror. Their greatest weapons had failed, and their strongest ship had been erased with a whisper. There was no negotiation. There was no mercy. The human warship continued forward, unstoppable, untouchable. The remaining Dominion ships broke formation, fleeing in all directions, their captains abandoning all sense of duty. They had never known fear before. Now, they knew what it meant to face something beyond their understanding. From the safety of the Dominion's homeworld, High Admiral Kelkoth watched the battle unfold. His face, once hardened by years of war, now showed something unseen in the Dominion's long history: pure, undeniable fear. The warship had not just destroyed their fleet. Then, the line went dead. The Dominion's greatest fleet had been wiped from existence. The impossible warship continued forward. And for the first time in history, the galaxy realized that the Dominion was no longer the strongest force in the universe. The destruction of the Dominion's most powerful fleet should have been impossible. Yet, it had happened. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as the news spread: 500 warships had vanished, erased by a single unknown vessel. No wreckage remained, no survivors to tell the tale. Every military strategist, every scientist, every ruler across the Dominion struggled to explain what had happened. How could a lone warship defy the laws of physics? How could it absorb firepower meant to shatter planets and return destruction with a mere whisper of energy? It made no sense, and that was what terrified them the most. For the first time in Dominion history, fleets stopped advancing. Entire sectors went dark as admirals refused to engage the enemy, fearing they would meet the same fate. The Dominion's war machine, which had conquered hundreds of species and ruled with absolute dominance, was now frozen in hesitation. No one wanted to be the next to face the impossible warship. High Admiral Kelkoth sat in the war room of the Dominion homeworld, surrounded by terrified generals and advisors. The fear in their eyes was unmistakable. How do we fight something that doesn't follow the rules of war? One of them whispered. No one had an answer. The warship had ignored every weapon, defied every tactic, and erased the mightiest fleet in history without effort. Panic spread to the Dominion's colonies. News of the warship's unstoppable advance turned into whispered legends, then into full-blown hysteria. Governors sent desperate messages, demanding protection, but the Dominion had none to offer. The enemy had not communicated beyond its chilling declaration. No demands, no negotiations, just an inevitable march forward. Civil unrest exploded on distant worlds. Citizens who once believed the Dominion to be invincible now saw it for what it was: helpless. Then, the disappearances began. At first, it was small. An outpost near the battlefield went silent. A patrol squadron investigating the area never returned. One by one, entire space stations, military bases, and colonies simply vanished. It wasn't destruction. It wasn't war. It was as if the universe itself had erased them. Scans showed nothing. No debris, no energy signatures, just empty space where civilizations once existed. The fear turned to desperation. The Dominion's enemies, long thought to be weak and scattered, sensed the coming storm. Rebellions that had once been crushed under the Dominion's heel now rose again, emboldened by the chaos. Some species, once too afraid to challenge the Dominion's rule, now saw an opportunity to break free. The Dominion had been their oppressor for centuries, but now something far worse had arrived, and even their conquerors were powerless before it. Religious sects formed, worshipping the warship as a god of vengeance. Others believed it was not real at all, but a force of nature, punishing the Dominion for its centuries of cruelty. Scientists and engineers worked frantically to find answers, analyzing every piece of data from the battlefield, but nothing made sense. It doesn't generate power like our ships, one terrified researcher muttered. It doesn't move through space in any way we understand. It's not just stronger than us, it's something beyond our reality. The Dominion's ruling council convened in secret, their voices filled with fear. We must surrender, one of them said, breaking the unspoken rule that had kept their empire strong for centuries. The idea was unthinkable, but so was everything else. They had no idea what the warship wanted. It had not given them a chance to negotiate, had not responded to any attempts at communication. It simply continued forward, unstoppable, untouchable. High Admiral Kelkoth clenched his fists, his mind racing for a strategy. But what strategy could work against an enemy that did not follow the rules of war? A new transmission interrupted the meeting. A listening post at the edge of the Dominion's territory had detected the warship's next move. It was heading straight for the capital. The rulers of the Dominion, once feared by the entire galaxy, sat frozen in silence. The impossible warship was coming for them. The Dominion homeworld had never known fear. Its skies had never seen enemy warships, its defenses had never been tested, and its rulers had never considered the possibility of an invasion. For centuries, it had stood as the heart of the galaxy's most powerful empire, a place of absolute control and dominance. But now, the impossible warship was coming, and nothing could stop it. Every fleet that had tried had. In a last act of desperation, the Dominion threw everything they had into the final stand. Thousands of warships gathered in orbit, forming a wall of firepower unlike anything seen before. The planet's orbital stations, long thought to be symbolic rather than functional, were fully armed. On the surface, planetary defense grids hummed to life, massive cannons and missile batteries locking onto the empty void. The greatest minds of the Dominion, those who had built weapons that shattered moons, now stood powerless, hoping for a miracle. There was no strategy left, only survival. Then, the impossible warship arrived. It did not drop out of hyperspace. It did not emerge from the shadows. It was just there. One moment, the sky was clear. The next, the massive, silent vessel hovered above the homeworld, its dark hull stretching across the stars. Every Dominion officer watching the sensors felt the same terrifying realization: it had bypassed all defenses effortlessly. No alarms had sounded. No early warning systems had activated. It had simply arrived, as if reality itself had no control over it. The Dominion did not hesitate. The order to fire was given, and every warship in orbit unleashed their full firepower. The sky became a storm of destruction, energy beams, torpedoes, and hyper-accelerated projectiles screaming toward the enemy. The surface defenses joined in, launching planetary-scale weapons meant to rip apart entire fleets. The sheer amount of firepower unleashed in that moment could have wiped out 100 worlds. But as the explosions cleared, as the blinding light faded, the warship remained untouched. Panic gripped the Dominion's forces. Officers screamed for reports. Engineers scrambled for answers, but there were none. It had happened again. Their most powerful weapons had done nothing. The warship had not moved. It had not retaliated. It had simply ignored them. Then it acted. A single pulse, invisible yet undeniable, spread from the warship. The Dominion fleet began disappearing, ship by ship, entire battleships erased as if they had never existed. Some tried to flee, but space itself seemed to bend against them, dragging them back into nothingness. Admirals screamed orders that went unheard. Captains begged for mercy that never came. Within minutes, the greatest fleet ever assembled was gone. On the surface, the rulers of the Dominion stood in their grand chambers, watching in horror as their might crumbled. Their empire was dying, and there was nothing left to stop it. The planetary defenses opened fire one last time, a desperate, final attempt to do something, anything. But the warship did not acknowledge them. It simply continued its silent, unstoppable descent. And then it released its final judgment. A thin beam of light, almost delicate in appearance, lanced down toward the planet. It did not explode. It did not burn. Instead, it unraveled reality itself. The ground beneath the capital vanished, not destroyed, not scorched, simply erased from existence. The beam spread outward, consuming cities, fortresses, and every symbol of Dominion power. The planet itself began collapsing into nothingness, as if the universe had decided it no longer belonged. The last words broadcasted from the homeworld were not cries of defiance, nor declarations of war. They were screams of rulers who had never known fear, who had spent their lives believing they were gods, only to realize, too late, that gods had returned to remind them of their place. As the Dominion homeworld disappeared, as the last remnants of its empire fell into silence, the warship turned. Across the galaxy, every species, every ruler, every being that had once feared the Dominion now knew a greater terror. They had thought the Dominion was the ultimate power. They had thought the warship was an anomaly. But now, they understood the truth. Humanity had returned. And this was only the beginning. The Dominion was gone. The greatest empire the galaxy had ever known, the unchallenged rulers of thousands of worlds, had been erased in a matter of days. Their fleets had been shattered, their rulers had vanished, and their homeworld no longer existed. What remained were ruins, empty battlefields, and the echoes of a terror the galaxy had never seen before. Where once the Dominion's banners flew, now there was only silence. But silence was never meant to last. In the void left behind, something new was beginning. Across the galaxy, species that had lived in fear for centuries now stood at the edge of an uncertain future. Some saw the fall of the Dominion as liberation. Planets that had been under brutal occupation now rose in celebration, their people tearing down statues of their former rulers, their voices crying out in victory. But others saw something far more terrifying because the Dominion had not simply collapsed. It had been erased, not by war, not by rebellion, but by something far beyond understanding. A single warship had rewritten the course of history, and no one knew what would come next. The warship itself was gone. After the final destruction of the Dominion, it had simply disappeared. No transmissions, no warnings, no demands. Nothing. It was as if it had never been there to begin with. But its presence still lingered in the minds of every leader, every survivor, every person who had watched the impossible unfold. The galaxy had never feared humanity before. Now, they feared nothing else. In the outer worlds, where the Dominion's influence had always been weaker, chaos took hold. Without their overlords, factions rose to seize control. Some were remnants of old rebellions, eager to reclaim what had been stolen. Others were warlords, opportunists who saw a chance to carve out their own empires. Battles erupted on former Dominion strongholds as new rulers fought for control, but none dared speak of expanding too far. No one wanted to be noticed. No one wanted to be the next target. In the core worlds, where Dominion rule had been absolute, the fear ran deeper. Entire cities had been built on the belief that their empire was eternal. Now, those cities stood in stunned silence, their people afraid to even speak of the warship, as if doing so might bring it back. Government buildings remained empty. Streets once filled with marching soldiers were now lifeless. Without orders, without leaders, the core of the Dominion crumbled into nothingness. And then the first message came. It was not from the warship. It was not from any known power. It was a signal, simple yet undeniable, broadcast across every surviving Dominion world, every abandoned warship, every station still orbiting dead planets. It came from Earth. No one had spoken the name in centuries. It was a myth, a forgotten story buried under Dominion history. Humanity had vanished long before the Dominion rose to power. No records existed of their fall, no evidence of their exile. Some had believed they'd been wiped out by a greater force. Others had dismissed them as a primitive race that had simply faded away. But the warship had changed everything. The galaxy now knew the truth. Humanity had never been gone. They had been waiting, watching, preparing. And now they had returned. The message was short, yet it carried the weight of an empire far older than the Dominion. The old order is gone. The galaxy will not be ruled by fear any longer. The Dominion's time has ended. Now, something new begins. It was not a threat. It was not a declaration of war. It was a promise. For the first time in history, the galaxy was leaderless. The Dominion had controlled everything, dictated the laws, crushed those who opposed them. Now, those chains were broken, and the future belonged to whoever had the courage to claim it. But beneath the hope, beneath the celebrations and the chaos, one truth remained. The warship had erased an empire in days. If humanity had chosen to return, if they had chosen to shape the future, then one thing was clear. They were the new rulers of the galaxy.